What I love about Kafka is the absurdity.
You don't really know what's happening inside the person.
He's not the only one who transforms throughout this novel. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Better Read Than Dead. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing Franz Kafka's absurdist novel, The Metamorphosis. And this novel is the story of a salesman called Gregor Samsa, who wakes up in the morning to find that he has been transformed into a monstrous cockroach, insect, or beetle, depending on the translation that you are reading. And the book goes into how this affects his life after that and how this affects his family. But to process this strange and disturbing book, I am very pleased to be joined by Lorraine Finlay, who is a law specialist. She's worked in the High Court, she's been a state prosecutor, she's a published author, but most importantly, she was the Student's Choice for Best Lecturer at IPA Academy last year and a great friend of the Generation Liberty team. Thank you for joining us, Lorraine.
Thanks for having me, Renee.
And also in studio with me, I have from my illustrious Generation Liberty team, our favourite medical student, Peumike.
Thanks, Renee. Very excited for this. Kafka definitely provides a lot to discuss in his works and very, very excited.
Yes, I am very excited to get started too. And this is a really, really interesting novel and there's so many ways that we can look at it. But Peumike, I thought you could start us off by just telling us a little bit about Kafka himself.
Franz Kafka is probably one of the most transformational figures in literary history, and I think arguably one of the best in the modern era. And he's from a German-speaking Jewish background, and he grew up around the turn of the 20th century, and he's really renowned for bringing out the absurdist aspects of life and really putting it in a lens which no one really did before and creating this new kind of movement called the kind of Kafkaesque movement. And it's something that's been so powerful, so transformational, and something that is going to be a pleasure to discuss today and something I'm really looking forward to.
Lorraine, when I contacted you about coming onto the show and talk to you about the books that we are discussing, and we got onto Kafka, you actually lamented that we could do the trial next series. I wonder if you've got a particular affinity to that, perhaps because of your legal background. But kind of connected to that, why would you say that young people, maybe those particularly in law, if you want, should read Kafka?
I'm a little bit of a law nerd, so anything that's got a courtroom, a trial, a setting that's connected to law, I'm in already. But what I love about Kafka is the absurdity because, law is all about order and stability and predictability and just trying to create clarity. And Kafka creates worlds where none of those things exist, where you just have to completely suspend logic to be part of the story. And, it's a very un-PC thing to say now, but literature is meant to take you places you've never been before. It's meant to give you experiences that you've never had. And for me, Kafka just takes you beyond your lived experience because it requires you to just have this suspension of logic and to go into a world that is unpredictable and uncertain. And that's what I love about it.
I kind of love the dreamlike quality of his writing, which is at once absurdist, but also so descriptive that you kind of feel immersed in his world so immediately. But moving on to this, there's so many places we could start, but I thought the easiest place that we could start would be the beginning, and that is Gregor's reaction to waking up in the morning and being turned into a giant cockroach. Which is quite bizarre. He doesn't focus on it for very long, and he's soon immediately thinking about how he's late, how he's going to explain this to his boss, that he's missed his train. And it's quite an absurd reaction. Lorraine, how do you interpret the reaction of this central character?
I mean, his reaction is startling, but also the reaction of his family. I mean, what amazes me about the whole thing is nobody really stops to ask, why has this happened? How can we fix this? There's just kind of an acceptance of it and, almost a resignation that permeates the entire book because they move straight to an adaptation, sort of adapting to the transformation rather than fighting against it right from the beginning. And I think also the fact that his very first reaction is, I'm going to be late for work, when he's lying on the bed as a huge bug, is just astonishing.
I found it really strange. And I also think it does play into the kind of dreamlike nature of Kafka's work, how it's often described as dreamlike, because I don't know about your dreams, but sometimes absurd things happen in dreams and you just accept it.
Yeah.
You don't question it in the dream. And it kind of, why you can kind of understand his worlds is you've kind of experienced this, maybe not in your conscious self, but in your unconscious self. What are your thoughts on Gregor's reaction?
I mean, that's exactly right. Because if you think about dreams, like when you first start a dream, there's no actual start point, is there? You're just in the dream. And it's just quite an interesting situation because you apply like everyday normal conventions to this new dreamlike fantasy world. And it's quite bizarre to see how that kind of unfolds, especially with Kafka and Gregor. And I'm just quite fascinated because that kind of mentality of thinking about work, thinking about your livelihood, thinking about how you're going to get by despite the circumstance of waking up as a bug, I think is actually quite telling of today's society as well, considering how much we're kind of in tune with this kind of work mentality and putting that first and foremost as opposed to recognizing what's in front of us at any given time. So I think that kind of merges well with what we have today and our perceptions of what society is at the moment.
Yeah. And
another thing that's really interesting, Renee, about what he does, which is a little bit, I think, removed from what we do today, his first reaction is not about him. How has this happened to me? What's going on? It's how does this affect my family? How does this affect my boss? And he's worried about the impact on other people, which, he's a really interesting character, I think, because he's had this enormous transformation, yet there's a selflessness about the way he responds to it because he's so worried about the impact it will have on other people. And his despair is not so much about his own life, but about what it means for his family.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think it's true of a lot of Kafka's characters is they're quite passive and not self-centered and but very outward looking and looking about how things are going to affect others. But looking at the symbolism of being transformed into a cockroach, or it could be a beetle, the original transformation actually said, I think in German means vermin. So it's it depends, but we kind of get an indication that it's more a bug, not a rat or anything by the description of the creature itself. Peumike, what do you think is the symbolism for why Kafka chose this above all any other kind of transformation?
I think it was trying to represent something which was a pest more than anything, and a pest which was kind of substandard or seen as lesser than, or something which was a burden more than anything else. And I think it was through that kind of mechanism that he allowed us to really explore the ideas of duty, of family duty, about even if someone's lower to this extent, to the point of a bug, which is literally the lowest in the food chain, how are we going to respond to that? And how would support structures organize itself to accommodate that? And I think it also provided the opportunity to explore how selfless we could be as well, and also how kind of hopeless that if we thrust into these kind of circumstances, how little help we can get from the outside, and how we kind of have to resort to our own internal realm to kind of rationalize everything that's going on. And it provides a kind of way of promoting self-reflection and a kind of understanding from within yourself that you might not have otherwise achieved by having some kind of creature that could have some kind of mobility or action further than that. It provides us an opportunity to really explore the internal realm. And I think that's something quite powerful, and why he chose a cockroach in particular.
It's so strange that he kind of feels like he's fighting with losing his humanity, but then he gains a completely new perspective on the world around him because of this transformation. Lorraine, what are your thoughts on why this was chosen and kind of the symbolism behind it?
One of the stories I love about the story is that Kafka actually wrote to his publisher initially when this book was first released and stated that he didn't want any pictures of the insect or bug or cockroach or whatever it was, and that he wanted readers to be able to imagine the creature. So again, it feeds into this dreamlike quality that we don't actually know exactly what the character has turned into. We don't know what he is. We're not really given we're given bits and pieces. Some suggest a cockroach, some bits suggest a different type of insect or bug. So you never really know, other than there's been a transformation that makes him repulsive. If he turned into a unicorn, the story would have been totally different. So, the fact that he turned into that type of a creature, I think, is really important in terms of just showing that insignificance and repulsion and that alienation from the world. But I think what's also interesting about the transformation is it's not complete. You know, the physical form's changed, but particularly initially, he is still able to communicate for a very short period, and he still retains that sort of link to his humanity. And then you see, as the physical sort of takes over, he starts to lose that more and more as the book goes on, which is really interesting symbolism in itself about, you know, what it is that makes us human and what differentiates us from other types of creatures.
Yeah, and just going on from what Lorraine said, I think there's a saying that life's 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. Gregor did start off kind of like a cockroach or a vermin or whatever, but it was his acceptance of how other people treated him which kind of also created that kind of descent down into more and more of the kind of vermin that people thought he was and that he was turning into. So it's a kind of affirmation of who he was, which pushed him further and further down that path. And I think that's something not too dissimilar to what we see today with even our own criminal justice system, potentially, and how we treat a lot of criminals, in which if we keep telling them that they're this kind of way, that they keep pushing themselves down that pathway and think with that kind of mentality, or with anything else which is out of the ordinary. If you have some kind of potentially different view, if you are seen as different and you are seen as overly different, and people continue to believe that you're overly different, you push down that way and you go more and more radical with that kind of positioning.
Yeah. Following from that, Lorraine, what are your thoughts on what Peumike has said, that, you know, how others perceive you can really feed into something and make you more of that, especially touching on that within kind of criminal justice as well?
I think one of the most interesting things about the book isn't actually Gregor's transformation, but the way other people react to it. So his family's reaction. And there's this great quote. There's an essay that Nabokov wrote about the Metamorphosis, where he spoke about this reaction. And he said, Gregor is a human being in an insect's disguise, but his family are insects disguised as people. And I think that is really true, because the reaction to him is just that they don't treat him with any humanity. And it's really interesting how quickly that physical form that he takes on becomes his entire identity in terms of the way people perceive him. And I think there is, you know, something important that you can draw from that in terms of how we treat people, and the way we often don't look at those internal things. We look at instead, you know, what they look like on the outside and what they seem to us to be, without really trying to understand anything deeper than that.
It struck me when I was reading it, especially when they're talking about like how much of a burden he is. And they are three people looking after one dependent, and he was one person looking after three dependents, and looking after him is just too much for them, even though he had done so much for them in the first place. So that concept of a burden. And when I thought about Gregor's ailment, Peumike, I couldn't help but also draw a connection to terminal illness and how that could affect a family. Not to say that anyone with an illness is, you know, grotesque in this way, but they may feel like that, and they may feel some similarity to the process that Gregor goes through. You're studying medicine. Did that occur to you when you were reading this?
No, I mean, it kind of did feel like what someone in the palliative care ward would feel like following a potentially battle with cancer, or if you lose that consciousness or ability to communicate with the patient. You're kind of thrust into this situation where you don't really know what's happening inside the person, inside the patient, but we are now in a position where we have to kind of make decisions on the outside, and we have to justify our own actions about something that we don't know is actually happening inside the actual human being, or in this case, Gregor. And I think it's kind of weird how we see the kind of different ways in which we can, different humans can actually respond to this scenario. Because in the book we see the Gregor's sister actually justifying letting go of Gregor because Gregor's no longer there, or Gregor, it's not the same Gregor anymore, so therefore we don't have an obligation to look after him. And on the other hand, we also see the mother as well. She's probably a bit more caring towards Gregor in that sense, because she was still clinging on to the fact that, okay, Gregor might still be in this thing. in fact, in the book, they call it an it. And we see the two sides of the spectrum here. We have one side in which they justify getting rid of Gregor because it's no longer Gregor anymore. But then there's also the humanity still left within the mother, I feel, in trying to cling on to something that, okay, Gregor might come back to who he was before.
Tying back to those family bonds. And I think, Lorraine, you're really right. He's not the only one who transforms throughout this novel. The family transforms, and also the kind of structure and hierarchy of the family itself changes throughout the novel. Can you just tell us your thoughts on that and the transformations of kind of each character throughout the book?
Well, I mean, touching on what Peumike just said, one of the really interesting transformations, I think, is the daughter or the sister of Gregor, because, initially she's the one who is the kindest to him. She brings him food, she cleans his room. But you see that shift, and at the end, she's the one who says, we have to get rid of him. So she's actually the one that initially felt the greatest sense of obligation, but then very quickly thinks of him as a burden. And yet, interestingly, she doesn't want to let that burden go. You remember there's one point in the book where she has a hysterical reaction to somebody else in the family trying to clean his room because that's her burden to bear. So her transformation is fascinating. And I think the family's reaction as well is interesting in highlighting that broader theme of Kafka's, where he sort of manages to have both hope and hopelessness in the same book and in the same story. And so you see at the end of this, and I don't want to, give a plot spoiler, but Gregor ends up in a hopeless situation, and yet his hopelessness gives the family their ending of hope. So you get this sense of the world can be an unpredictable, hopeless, absurd place that puts people in these difficult situations that they never recover from. And yet at the same time, from the family's reaction, you see the world just keeps turning. And it doesn't stop. Even when Gregor's gone through this enormous transformation, life just keeps going on for everybody else, which is quite depending on your perspective, that's something that's either a great source of optimism or a great source of despair.
Yeah, kind of touching on that hopelessness and also kind of the idea of the Kafkaesque. I always like to tie these conversations back and these books back to their relevance to the modern world. And I think maybe Metamorphosis is more relevant now than it's been in a while. And I'm going to talk about it in relation to the lockdowns that much of the world has experienced. And I think I would maybe go as far as to say what some people experienced in lockdown, especially in places like Melbourne, was Kafkaesque to a degree. Peumike, what do you think about that?
No, I absolutely do. And even just the idea of COVID, it's quite an absurd kind of proposition, right? And the lockdowns as well, and the bureaucracy surrounding that. And for that to be kind of thrust onto us as a society, I can almost liken that to Gregor waking up as a cockroach, because it's just such a bizarre, and the word unprecedented comes out again, but an unprecedented circumstance that we find ourselves in. And I think the idea with the Kafkaesque is that it's not so much as trying to reverse what had already happened, but dealing with what's happening in the present time and making sure that you acknowledge it for what it is, and then trying to work out what the best solution is going forward. And I think some of the issues, and I don't want to get too political, with the government response to it, is they weren't necessarily dealing with what the crisis was at the given time. They were almost trying to reverse the situation to a point in which it impeded on everything that was good and fun about society. So I think that's where this kind of interplay happens, and also the bureaucracy which came into place as well with the lockdowns, I think is indicative of the kind of work structure in place in the Metamorphosis in the book as well. So we see those parallels there, which are quite pertinent as well.
Yeah, Lorraine, I think Peumike has touched on some really good points there, and I think there is definitely a connection to people feeling very powerless at this time, or trapped within kind of bureaucratic mazes, and feeling, definitely like they don't have control anymore. That kind of enters into the concept of the Kafkaesque. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think adding to it, the other thing that Kafka does so well, particularly through this story, is to highlight the importance of connectedness to what it means to be human. the actual physical transformation that Gregor goes through, he might be in a different form, but he's not actually physically separated from his family. He's still in the next room. They're still in the same house. The actual story takes place in a very small area, and yet the emotional disconnect between them is just immediate. And I think that does reflect, what people have felt over the course of this year. It's that lack of human connection and that ability to have people with you that has been just so devastating for so many people. And that's something that, we can measure direct health outcomes in terms of how many people have been infected, how many people have died. And in that respect, Australia's result to the pandemic has been absolutely, incredible by international standards. But I think, what this book shows us is there is a cost more than just the direct physical transformation. It's actually the emotional cost to Gregor and the cost to his family in terms of the inability for him to work and to contribute and to support them that really is the most central part of that transformation.
Yeah, and just to draw on from that point that Lorraine was talking about how now, because of lockdowns, a lot of people have had to lost their jobs, right? And this is kind of the situation that Gregor finds himself in as well. It's the idea that now, because he's not contributing anymore, he doesn't have the kind of same value almost in the family structure. He's almost lost his sense of purpose, his sense of direction in this present time. And that's actually quite a powerful thing, especially for someone who was previously the breadwinner of the family, someone who was almost a rock, the foundation of the family. Now going to this situation of powerlessness, that has devastating consequences on one's mental health. Like, it cannot be understated because it's a complete role reversal, right? You're not doing what you used to do before, and now your kind of essence of what you've been doing your entire life, because especially for Gregor, his work was his life and supporting his family, right? You just lose that. And the mental health consequences because of that is devastating. And that's one of the reasons why in the medical profession, when you're conducting a medical history, one of the most important questions to ask is, how is your work? How are you supporting your family? What kind of social structures do you have? Because the consequences that has for one's mental health, and I think we can see that now with the growing problems with mental health with a lot of Victorians, a lot of Australians, is the importance that has on our being, and to disregard that, especially with the kind of measures that's been taking place in the Victorian government and the Australian government, is quite ridiculous, to be honest.
Yeah, kind of touching on that, it's true that Kafka's characters are very passive, and they're not people of action. Things happen to them, they don't make things happen. I think he's kind of highlighting the absurdity of this acceptance, especially by using kind of these absurd, dreamlike qualities to kind of wake up the reader and say, you actually need to acknowledge the absurdity of this. You need to acknowledge that in some ways, these are a creation of your own mind, that you've kind of created this thing that you can't escape, and you're not as powerless as you may think. Lorraine, do you think I'm onto something there, and that's kind of where Kafka's going with his writing?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, the title gives it away. It's Metamorphosis. So he's not talking about trying to understand what has happened, but his books are all about adaptation. The characters don't rail against the situation that they're in, and in this case, they don't ask why. They just kind of get on with adapting their life to fit around what's happened. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about Kafka's books. There's this absurdity, and he talks about how life can just be so unpredictable and unfair and absurd, and yet the world keeps turning. In this book, a character becomes like a giant bug, and yet the family kind of keeps going with their life, and it just moves on. And I think that's really interesting because, again, it mixes for me the hope and the hopelessness that even when enormous transformations occur, there is a hope that you can adapt and you can keep moving on.
I thought we should touch on the ending of this book. So, spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't finished reading. Maybe switch off now, finish it and come back. But Lorraine, what are your thoughts on how this book ends, and the kind of even the moments before that where Gregor's like hearing his sister play violin.
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, that right at the end you get this move back to the human side of his nature. You know, that music touches something in him that he's lost through the transformation. And yet what really struck me about the ending was just how almost ordinary it was. You know, you've had this enormous transformation, and yet at the end he just dies and the family gets rid of him, and then they move on and they start talking about finding a husband for the daughter. So again, it's this absurdity of enormous transformation occurring, and yet the day-to-day just keeps going on under the surface, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, I actually found that particularly disturbing, them kind of looking at the daughter and like, oh, isn't she's turned out beautiful? And it almost felt to me like turning to the next victim. You know, fresh meat, we've kind of done away with our son, but, you know, we've got our daughter left. And it just, that part actually really gave me the creeps, even though it's, I don't know if it necessarily everyone interprets it that way. Peumike, what did you think of the ending of the novel?
Well, I think Lorraine kind of touched on it. The remarkable thing about the ending was that it was quite unremarkable. Like at the beginning, I was expecting when I first read it that Gregor's going to come out with a big flashbang at the end and there's going to be some kind of massive scene where the father stabs him or something like that. But it just turns out he dies of pretty much natural causes or after, due to the consequences of the apple lodging in his back. And it was kind of a slow death as opposed to the kind of violent death that I was expecting, that I was kind of hoping for. But it was, I think it kind of matches the vibe that Kafka was going for, and the idea of the absurdity of it all. And also, it also signified a kind of reversal from what we have at the start of the book. The way I like to see the Metamorphosis is that the end is a polar opposite of the beginning. And you see that with the roles in the family as well. Now we have not only is the daughter a vibrant woman who's now of marrying age and all that kind of stuff as well, but also the father, because the father at the beginning, he also lacked a lot of kind of self-respect and resilience within himself. But towards the end of the book, and I think his uniform is a symbol of that, that kind of understanding, okay, I can now support this family. I have respect for myself, and people have respect for me and the contribution that I can make. So it's a real kind of flip, and I love how Kafka has done this, because it's two polar opposites, but in the same way, it's kind of the similar as like you talked about before. It's the start of something new, and it's going to keep on going like that, going from pole to pole, from end to end. And I think it's that inevitability and absurdity of life that Kafka's touching on there, which is quite powerful.
I still have a feeling that father could go back to his ways if they manage to marry the daughter off to someone wealthy.
Easily. He's
easily going to just go back to being relying on someone else, and he doesn't have to deal with Gregor anymore. He's out of the way. So I think there was almost, I felt like a glimmer that he was seeing her as an opportunity to return to kind of that lazy lifestyle of before. But so we don't end on such a dreary note, I thought that we could discuss some recommendations for our audience. And as you kind of touched on earlier, Peumike, Kafka is an amazingly influential figure, and he influenced not only other novels, but art movements, films, theatre, all these creations. So I thought I'd ask both of you for a recommendation of a work of art, whatever kind of medium that would be, that if the viewer enjoyed this book, that they may also enjoy. So I thought I'd start with you first, Peumike.
Yeah. Well, mine is pretty direct to Kafka and Metamorphosis. It's the statue of Kafka's head in Prague. It's a massive contraption. It's 39 tons. It's made out of metal, and it's got different pieces. And the pieces are actually coordinated and connected through the internet to move to different wavelengths. And it's something which is quite bizarre and quite so Kafkaesque in the sense that it's so absurd to have something like that so modern in a traditional Prague city street. And symbolically, I think it kind of represents my perception of what I think Kafka's trying to show with personal identity, about who he considered himself to be, because if you look at the statue, the different parts of it are actually moving all the time. And my idea of personal identity is something that's in a constant change of flux and is actually reaffirmed by how you respond to what's around you, because the actual statue itself, it reflects everything around it. And insofar as we are a reflection of how we interpret the world and how the world interprets us, I think it's quite telling of what a human being is in today's age.
Yeah, I actually have to check that out. That sounds awesome. I hope to see it in person one day. Lorraine, what work of inspired by Kafka or based on Kafka would you recommend to our audience?
Well, I just want to go and see that now because I think that just sounds amazing. I was going to initially go for the really obvious and just say, if you like Metamorphosis, you have to read The Trial. It's sort of the obvious next step. And that's not just because I'm putting in a big bid for the next edition of, the book club to read that. But I think if you like Kafka and the absurd nature of his writing, one of my other favourite books is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. And I think, in terms of describing the absurdity of war and the absurdity of the bureaucracy, that's a book that really borrows heavily from Kafkaesque ideas. It was written around 40 years after Kafka died, but you can definitely see the influence that Kafka's writing had in the way that story develops. So I think that's another really good book to read.
That is an excellent recommendation. I think the thing that I'm going to recommend, which I actually found while studying this novel for this show, is there is a 1993 short film that won Best Short Film and got an Academy nomination for Best Short Film called Franz Kafka's It's a Wonderful Life, starring Richard E. Grant as Kafka, Richard E. Grant just needs to be in more films. And it starts with the process, I won't give it away, but it starts with the process of Kafka writing Metamorphosis, and him at the desk, and he's going, Gregor was transformed into and he goes through different things that he could be transformed to. And it's both absurd, but also kind of darkly humorous. So highly recommend if you enjoyed that book. But I think that's kind of getting us to the end of our discussion today. Thank you both so much for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Peumike, and thank you, Lorraine, for all your wonderful insights and for giving up your time to be on Better Read Than Dead today.
Thanks so much for having me. I loved it.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to the next one.
We've got some great episodes coming up. And Peumike, can you just tell our audience how they can get involved in Better Read Than Dead, the Generation Liberty Book Club?
All you have to do is go onto the Generation Liberty website at generationliberty.org.au. It's $10 for a membership for Better Read Than Dead Book Club, but it's free for Generation Liberty members. I highly recommend it. It's well worth the money. And make sure to follow us on Facebook and social media, wherever you are in the world.
Definitely make sure you follow us to keep up to date with all the future episodes. But for now, thank you for joining us for another episode of Better Read Than Dead. I hope you're getting through your list of books, and I hope that you join us next time.